In the interest of full disclosure, I would like to make viewers aware that for illustrative purposes and where no contemporary images were available, I have used AI to recreate images and footage in this video. Reading accounts of the 19th century East End, you could be forgiven for perceiving it as a lawless, crime-infested slum on which the sun rarely shone and where cultural pursuits were all but non-existent. Whereas this was the case with small enclaves of the district, the Victorian East End was by no means the bleak, uncultured backwater that it is often made out to have been. For a start, it had a thriving theatre and music hall scene, and several of the stars of the age cut their dramatic teeth on the stages of the likes of the Royal Cambridge Music Hall on Commercial Street, Foresters on Cambridge Heath Road, the Paragon on Mile End Road, and Marlowe's Music Hall on Bow Road. However, one of the East End's most popular theatrical venues, and its first major theatre, was the Royal Pavilion on Whitechapel Road. Built in 1827 on the site of a former factory, the Royal Pavilion, or simply the Pavilion as it was more commonly known, staged a diverse array of entertainments that ranged from Shakespeare to Cook's celebrated company of equestrian artistes, which included Paul Pry and his wife on horseback and the Merry Miller's Frolic. In April 1846, audiences could even enjoy what was advertised as the long-promised gigantic Easter novelty with costly dresses, 150 in number, gorgeous scenery, splendid properties, banners, appointments, new music, dances, 60 fairies, and 80 female warriors. A splendid time was guaranteed for all. One of the most popular performers at the Pavilion in the late 1840s and early 1850s was the comedian James Henry Walker Elphinstone. Elphinstone was in fact an adopted stage name. He had been born just plain James Henry Walker in the City of London Lying-in Hospital on City Road in 1818. On the 24th of August 1847, when he was 28, he married 17-year-old Helen Norman at the Church of St. Martin in the Fields off Trafalgar Square. For the next few years, they lodged with his parents at number 48 Bishopsgate, a 20 or so minute walk from the Pavilion Theatre, so a convenient abode from which he could comfortably walk to work. Soon, James and Helen had welcomed the first of their 7 children into the world, and life was pretty decent for James Henry Walker Elphinstone, both professionally and personally. But in 1850, a dark cloud drifted over his idyllic situation. Towards the end of April, as Elphinstone strolled onto the stage each night, he began to notice 2 women who were in regular attendance at his performances. Night after night he would see them sitting in one of the boxes watching him, and one of them, a tall, pretty woman who looked to be in her mid-20s, appeared particularly enamoured with him, and she would laugh uproariously to the point of overreaction at his jokes, and gaze at him with a longing look of disconcerting intensity. Unbeknownst to James Walker Elphinstone, he had acquired what today would be recognised as a stalker, and her obsession with him would almost have fatal consequences. The 2 women were Sarah Holborough, the wife of a sailor who lived on William Street off Commercial Road, and her good friend, 26-year-old Martha Sharpe, a widow whose husband had died the previous year and who had recently become a lodger at Sarah's house. All that we really know about Martha's past is that she was born in South Shields, and that prior to coming to London she had lived in Seaham Harbour, Durham, where her daughters, Anna, who was 3, and Margaret, who was 1, had been born. We can only surmise that, following her husband's death, Martha had brought her children to London and had put up at the home of her good friend Sarah Holborough, who later stated that she had known Martha for 2 or 3 years. Martha appears to have been blissfully unencumbered by her parental responsibilities, and the 2 women would go out every night and had become regulars at several pubs in Whitechapel, one of their favourites being the King's Head in Baker's Row. Since the King's Head was right next to the stage door of the Pavilion, it also happened to be a favoured haunt of the actors from the theatre. Whether Martha Sharpe initially became aware of James Elphinstone in the King's Head, or whether she first saw him when he was performing at the Pavilion Theatre, is unknown. What is known is that by May 1850 she had become absolutely besotted with him, and according to Sarah Holborough,
He was the constant subject of her conversation, and she was in the habit of speaking of him in terms of the warmest admiration, and was most anxious to become acquainted with him.
A wiser friend might have counselled Martha to curb her enthusiasm, but Sarah seems to have enjoyed the intrigue and was more than happy to act the part of Cupid in her friend's obsessive pursuit of James Elphinstone. According to Elphinstone's later testimony, he never actually spoke to Martha, but rather Sarah would relay messages to him on her friend's behalf, which, he said, pestered him with her importunities and endeavoured to force intimacy upon him. However, he made it perfectly clear that he was not in the least bit interested, explaining to Sarah that he was a happily married family man. Unperturbed, Martha wrote him several letters, which were delivered by the loyal Sarah, each one with the same objective, but he never replied to them. In fact, he burnt them. One night in early June 1850, the two women came to the stage door, anxious for his response to Martha's latest missive, in which she had invited him to take a walk with her in the hope that they could become better acquainted. When he came out, he brusquely told them that he had nothing to say to them and hurried on his way. Martha appeared greatly chagrined and exasperated at such a reception, Sarah later testified. She became convinced that Sarah must have done something wrong when delivering the latest communication, and saying that she would much like to have spoken to him, she expressed her determination before long to do so. The problem was, how could she get Elphinstone to change his mind and pay attention to her? It was then that fate intervened and added a potentially tragic twist to the drama. Martha was told by another woman she knew that she had become similarly obsessed with a Mr. Gaskell, another actor at the Pavilion Theatre, and that she had sent that actor a tart laced with Spanish fly in order to encourage his affections towards her. Presumably the aphrodisiac had been successful. Either that or Mr. Gaskell was possessed of looser morals than James Henry Walker Elphinstone. Whichever, Martha Sharpe became convinced that the solution to thawing the heart and passion of James Elphinstone lay in her acquiring a dose of Spanish fly. Her next problem was how to acquire it. Spanish fly is neither a fly nor is it Spanish. It is in fact an emerald green beetle, Litter vesicatoria, a member of the Meloidae family, commonly known as blister beetles on account of the fact that they secrete a substance called cantharis, a burning agent that causes terrible blisters on contact with the skin and which is passed by the male to the female beetle during copulation. She then covers her eggs with it as a deterrent against predators. And I bet you weren't expecting a lesson on the sex life of beetles when you clicked on this video. In the past, it was an established medical practice for doctors to blister their patients in order to draw out fever and infections. Spanish fly, with its bullae-inducing properties, was ideal for this purpose and was therefore widely stocked by apothecaries. It is, however, extremely toxic. If ingested, it can cause extremely unpleasant symptoms that include agonizing stomach pains, vomiting and diarrhea, and can be fatal even in relatively small doses. As a consequence of these dangers, Spanish fly could legally only be sold to acknowledged medical professionals. However, there was one further side effect that made it desirable to those with zero medical knowledge. In humans, in addition to the aforementioned maladies, it also causes a warm sensation in the urinary tract, and in men this can result in a raging erection that is impossible to get rid of. Because of this latter response, it achieved an undeserved and misleading reputation as an aphrodisiac, and it was quite common for people to mix it with drinks and sweets, sometimes with the knowledge of the imbiber or the consumer, but at other times surreptitiously in the hope that it would induce passion. It was with this later intention in mind that Martha one morning summoned her loyal friend Sarah, and the two women made their way to the shop of Mr. O'Connor, apothecary of Church Street, Mile End. O'Connor listened intently to Martha's request, but having done so, he shook his head and informed her that, although he kept a stock of Spanish flies, he was not allowed to sell it directly to the public. Martha, though, was persistent, and the apothecary eventually relented and told her that, although he was not permitted to sell her any, there was nothing to say that he couldn't give her some. So saying, he handed over a whole beetle along with several fragments wrapped in paper. Amazingly, he even inquired whether she intended to give it to a young man. Martha replied in the affirmative and asked him how much she should administer to the man in question in order to achieve the desired result. The chemist informed her that he had furnished her with enough for 4 doses. As the 2 women left the shop, Sarah asked Martha what she intended to do with the Spanish flies, to which Martha replied that she would not mind giving some to Mr. Elphinstone. Certain that the man of her dreams would soon be hers, Martha set about finding a way to dispense the aphrodisiac without arousing his suspicions. Her first attempt appears to have ended in disappointment. On the night of the 22nd of July, having finished that night's performance, Elphinstone dropped in at the King's Head for a glass of ale before heading home. Martha and Sarah were standing at the bar, and as he entered, Martha sent Sarah over to invite him to take some gin and water with them. He declined the offer and went over to the opposite side of the pub. He may well have had a lucky escape. The next evening, when he stepped out onto the stage of the pavilion, he looked up and saw 2 annoyingly familiar figures sitting in their usual box. Martha was looking particularly pleased with herself and, unseen by him, was clutching a small paper bag. Earlier that night she had purchased a raspberry jam tart from a local pastry shop, and having scooped out the jam, she had laid the Spanish fly carefully on the inside of the pastry case and had then replaced the jam. At 9 o'clock, when the curtain came down for the interval, William Davis, a waiter at the King's Head, was on his way to the pavilion carrying a tray of drinks for the actors. Martha and Sarah were standing at the stage door, and Martha asked him if he would kindly take a small paper bag to Mr. Elphinstone and tell him it was a gift from an admirer. Davis did as she requested, and on entering the theatre, handed the bag to Thomas King, Elphinstone's dresser. King delivered it to Elphinstone's dressing room and watched as the actor opened it, looked at the contents, closed the bag and told his dresser that he did not want it. Giving it back to King, he said that he could eat it or do what he liked with it. Tom King took the tart home and gave it to his wife Charlotte, who broke off a piece of the crust and ate it before retiring to bed for the night. Rising early the next morning, Charlotte felt a little peckish, and so she finished off what was left of the tart. She later recalled what happened next.
I ate almost all of it. I left the middle part where most of the green stuff was. I saw some green stuff but did not know what it was, and immediately after breakfast, consisting simply of tea, experienced the most acute pinching pains, principally in the throat, stomach and intestine, accompanied by the most violent retching, in the course of which I discharged portions of the tart, profusely mixed with blood and phlegm.
Panic-stricken at his wife's sudden illness, King sent for a doctor, and on the medic's arrival, he left her in the doctor's capable hands and took the remainder of the tart, which was about the size of a half-crown piece, to James Elphinstone, and told him that he suspected that his wife had been poisoned by it. Elphinstone took the fragment to Mr. Henry Thomas Cornelius, surgeon, of 71 Whitechapel High Street. Cornelius would later testify that
I examined it. It contained a considerable quantity of cantharides. They were bruised, not powdered. I found portions of several flies. They were of a golden-green colour. The effect upon a person from taking a quantity of cantharides would be to produce very violent pain in the stomach. In fact, the whole of the alimentary canal would suffer. It is an irritant poison. If the proportion in the rest of the tart was the same as it was in this, it would produce most alarming symptoms and would probably lead to fatal effects.
James Elphinstone was in no doubt about who had tried to poison him, and he marched round to Leman Street Police Station, where he denounced Martha Sharpe for trying to kill him. Over in William Street, Martha Sharpe was fantasizing wildly about how she would soon be in the passionate embrace of James Elphinstone, who would, she believed, take her in his arms and at last consummate their relationship. However, when a knock came at the door and she opened it, she was somewhat taken aback to find herself embraced instead by the long arm of the law in the portly shape of 2 burly police constables. They marched her round to Leman Street Police Station, where she was charged with feloniously administering to Charlotte King 30 grains of cantharides with intent to murder her, and with a second count of feloniously attempting to administer the same to James Walker Elphinstone with a like intent. On Thursday the 25th of July, Martha Sharpe, who was described by newspapers as being a respectable-looking person, about 30 years of age, attired in deep mourning and exhibiting the coolest indifference throughout, appeared before Mr. Combe, the magistrate at Worship Street Police Court. Having heard from various witnesses who related what had happened, Mr. Combe said that it was a most serious offence, and he remanded her in custody for a week in order that further depositions could be sought. Her next court appearance was on Thursday the 1st of August, when, according to the Morning Herald in its next day's edition, she regarded the whole proceeding with the most apathetic indifference. The case excited an unusual degree of interest, the paper continued, and the court was crowded by members of the theatrical profession and others who were anxious to hear the proceedings. The star witness that day was Sarah Holborough, who testified to Martha's obsession with Elphinstone and told of her attempts to get him to reciprocate her feelings, culminating in their visit to Mr. O'Connor, the apothecary. The magistrate opined that the apothecary's behaviour was reprehensible in supplying the prisoner with such a deleterious drug, and stated that he considered him culpable in the offence and demanded to know why O'Connor wasn't present in court to explain his conduct. One of the clerks, Mr. Hurstone, replied that it had just been communicated to him by the police that the apothecary referred to had abruptly left his shop and had not since been met with. Mr. Jackson, the solicitor appearing for the defence, contended that there was absolutely no case for his client to answer. There was, he argued, an entire absence of malice on the part of Martha Sharpe. She had not intended to injure either Mr. Elphinstone by forwarding him the tart or the woman who had accidentally partaken of it. Mr. Hamill concluded that since the case came down to the prisoner's motives, it was one for a jury to decide, and he therefore committed the prisoner to be tried at the Old Bailey. And with that, Martha Sharpe was taken away by police van to be lodged at Newgate Prison to await the next session. Her Old Bailey trial took place on Monday the 19th of August, with Mr. Baron Platt presiding, Mr. Robinson prosecuting, and Mr. Cooper appearing for the defence. Opening for the prosecution, Mr. Robinson pulled no punches about Martha Sharpe's character, morals and intentions. It appeared, he told the jury in his opening argument, that the prisoner had become attached to Mr. Elphinstone, comedian at the Pavilion Theatre, and endeavoured to induce him by various means to have improper intercourse with her. Throughout the day, the by now familiar litany of witnesses entered the box to testify as to what had occurred. William Davis told of how Martha had given him the tart and asked him to take it to Mr. Elphinstone. Thomas King testified to having taken the tart home, and his wife Charlotte repeated the symptoms she had suffered on eating it the next morning. She was still not fully recovered, she said, and had been under Mr. Cornelius ever since. Next came James Walker Elphinstone, who recounted Martha's repeated attempts to get him into conversation. The final witness was the surgeon, Henry Thomas Cornelius, who told how he had found a considerable quantity of cantharides in the piece of tart he had analysed. Asked by the prosecution if it was enough to kill someone, he replied,
"There is a great difference of opinion as to the amount required to destroy life. A very small quantity will have a fatal effect with some. With others it might pass off without any injurious or perhaps slight symptoms. That would depend upon the predisposition to irritability in the patient. I think a quantity put into a tart in the same proportion as this would be destructive to life."
Is there not an idea prevalent amongst women of the class of the prisoner that it is a stimulator of the passions? Mr. Cooper for the defence quizzed.
That is their idea. It is a common, vulgar idea. I have heard that it is sometimes taken by them as a love potion. It is not generally sold in chemist shops to ordinary persons. I should think a person decidedly wrong to sell this to a young woman. A chemist would know the properties. Some women labour under the delusion that by giving this they will make a man passionate towards them.
At this point, Mr. Cooper addressed the judge and told him that there was really no case for his client to answer, as there was no evidence to show that she'd intended to injure Charlotte King, as she was not even known to the prisoner. Mr. Robertson contended that if there was an intent to injure A and B was injured instead, that would still constitute an offence. The judge, however, sided with the defence and pointed out to the jury that since the essence of the case rested on Martha Sharpe's intent, Then they had to decide whether her intent had in fact been to injure Mr. Elphinstone, or whether the other intention suggested was the more probable one. The jury immediately returned a verdict of not guilty, and Martha Sharpe was acquitted. Thereafter she became just another resident of the Victorian East End. The 1851 census has her living at number 101 Devonport Street, along with her 2 daughters. Next door there is a Mary Sharpe, aged 60, who may have been her mother-in-law. We don't know what happened to her after that, as she simply fades into obscurity. As for James Henry Walker Elphinstone, his career went through a series of ups and downs. By 1856 he had become the co-proprietor of the Pavilion Theatre, albeit he suffered a major setback when in February that year the original theatre was destroyed by fire, and he turned out not to be insured. Later that year, he and Helen suffered a tragic personal loss when their 8-year-old daughter, Helen Rose, died. She was buried in Tower Hamlets Cemetery. The theatre was rebuilt, but Elphinstone moved on, becoming the proprietor of the Theatre Royal in Hanley, Stoke-on-Trent for many years. Helen died in February 1868 and was buried with their daughter. By the 1890s, Elphinstone was still the proprietor of Stoke's Theatre Royal, but had also become a circus proprietor, as well as the owner of another theatre in Douglas on the Isle of Man, which was where he was residing at the time of his death on the 12th of September 1892. His body was brought back to London, and he was laid to rest in Tower Hamlets Cemetery alongside his wife and daughter. And thus we close the book on another true crime case from the Victorian metropolis. This one might not have the drama and the gruesomeness of the Whitechapel murders, but it is nonetheless an intriguing tale that provides a tantalising glimpse into everyday life in the 19th century East End, and one that bears striking similarities with the storyline of Baby Reindeer, right down to the 2 protagonists even sharing a Christian name and a profession with the 2 main characters in the Netflix series. I can't help feeling sorry for Martha Sharpe, who strikes me as having been a woman who was lonely, probably still grieving, and so sought solace in an obsession with a comedian whose devotion to his wife meant that her advances were destined to remain unreciprocated. I suppose the unfortunate thing for James Elphinstone is that he never thought to turn his experience into a play which he could have billed as being based on a true story and then taken on the road to delight audiences across the country. After all, such a rich mix of love, lust, obsession, creepy crawlies and a raspberry tart make for an irresistible combination in anyone's book.